Hello, everyone. While we're waiting for everybody to get online here, the numbers are going up. What I'd ask is that you have a look on your screen at the poll and you can help us, let us know who we have on the call. We'll do that while we're just waiting for about a minute as the room fills up. Okay, great. I'm sure that people will continue trickling in, but maybe we can get started on time. My name is Randall Krantz. I'm an advisor on decarbonization at the Global Maritime Forum, and I'm working with the Fuels and Technologies workstream of the Getting to Zero Coalition. So I just wanted to welcome everybody to this webinar. The topic of this webinar is sustainability criteria for marine fuels, just to make sure that you're in the right place. And I wanted to say thank you to SSI for co-hosting this webinar with the Getting to Zero Coalition, and a reminder that the coalition itself is comprised of 3 partners, which are the Global Maritime Forum, the World Economic Forum, and the Friends of Ocean Action. As you may have heard when you joined, this session is being recorded, and that recording will be available after we're done with the session. For those of you who have just joined, there should be a poll on your screen that helps us know who we've got on the call. We'll be using a couple of different polls during this session to keep it interactive. And so this is a webinar format session, which means that if you're a participant, your camera won't be on and we won't see you. So you can relax from that end, but we do encourage you to participate actively. So we'll be doing questions and answers through the chat function. So you can pop your questions into the chat function. When you do that, try to make sure that you're sending your question to panelists and attendees. Otherwise, we sometimes answer your question without everybody knowing what the question was. For questions that are relevant to the conversation at hand, I will filter those and pass them on to our speakers. For those that are perhaps more tangential or related to the Getting to Zero Coalition more broadly, we'll try to answer those ones in the chat. If there's any questions that don't get answered, we will make sure that they're captured and answered in the summary documents from this webinar. So with that, maybe we can share the results of our first poll, see who we've got on the call. There we go. So we've got a large proportion of ship owners, managers, and operators, which is great. We've got some standard and certification bodies, which is fantastic when we're talking about sustainability criteria. It's great to see that we've got some fuel producers, suppliers, and academia and governments, IGOs, NGOs, which is a pretty broad category. We have some media on the line, or one media on the line, and a few others spread across. So we'll go ahead and close that, and then we'll ask a question, a second polling question, which is a little bit more relevant to the topic today. And the question here, it should be showing up shortly, is what sustainability themes are you most concerned about when it comes to zero and low carbon fuels? And so you can see on your screen there's a list. You obviously figured out how to do it on the first poll, so you'll figure it out here. But you can select a maximum of 3. They're listed in alphabetical order, not in any favorite priority, and make sure that you scroll down to see what's all the way to the bottom. And we'll give you a few seconds to do that. And then we'll post those results before we dive into the content of this session. So I'm just looking at my colleague Emma to see if there's any way to know how many people have answered. And we've got 60% answered, so we'll keep it for another couple of seconds. And okay, so we'll go ahead and share those results. Excellent. So here we can see we had a very broad set of criteria. So air quality, carbon source and hydrogen source, continuous improvement, food security, overwhelming winner of GHG emissions and other climate forcing factors, which is unsurprising given the topic of the webinar, but also some clear concerns on the upstream side: land use change, sustainable resource use, and ecological impacts of future fuels, safety as a strong issue, which is understandable, such an important thing for the industry. So thank you for that. That kind of helps us set the scene. And with that, I would like to introduce our panelists today. We've got 4 panelists. Catherine Palmer, the Global Sustainability Manager for Marine and Offshore at Lloyd's Register. Mark Lutz, Senior Advisor, Global Climate Policy, WWF Climate and Energy Practice. Simon Bennett, General Manager, Sustainable Development, the China Navigation Company, and Trevor Brown, Executive Director for the Ammonia Energy Association. What I'd like to do now is turn us over to Catherine Palmer. Catherine is going to set the scene for us and introduce some of SSI's preliminary sustainability criteria. So Catherine, over to you, camera on and slides rolling.
Yeah, thank you very much, Randall. So what I'm going to do now is really introduce the work that the Sustainable Shipping Initiative is doing and is contributing towards the Getting to Zero Coalition. And the focus for the SSI is looking at what is the sustainability criteria for potential low and zero carbon fuels, which will make up the marine fuel mix as we move towards 2030 and 2050. The discussion to date has been very much around price, availability, technical feasibility, safety, but also what we do need to understand is that the sustainability impacts from a life cycle perspective. So when it comes to selecting or choosing fuels, sustainability is included in that decision point, as well as the other parameters which I've already previously mentioned. And the important thing around looking at the sustainability issues from a life cycle perspective is to make sure that they are not causing any unintended impacts wherever along that life cycle perspective, i.e. from well to wake. The intention of the sustainability criteria is that they will be fuel agnostic, and they're intended for application for different feedstocks, different production pathways, and fuels produced by very different energy sources, primary energy sources. So it's not about, it's about having a set of criteria that is fuel agnostic and can be applied to anything. And therefore, that is able to facilitate an industry standard and set an industry standard for sustainability going forward, which enables certification bodies to be able to certify fuels to meeting these sustainability criteria. So as an end consumer or a purchaser of these fuels, you get assurance that you are purchasing a fuel that meets a set of sustainability criteria, has no unintended consequences elsewhere upstream within the supply chain, but also as a fuel producer, you're ensuring that you are producing a fuel that meets a standard that the market would want to purchase to. So what SSI is doing is taking a 3-phase approach on this work. And so our current phase that we are in at the moment is very much around defining a preliminary set of criteria for fuels. It's around defining a potential structure for that criteria. And it's about we're undertaking initial consultations with key industry stakeholders who are feeding into the development of this criteria and this structure. And then phase 2 is going to be about really unpacking and validating how we have defined the criteria, what we've set as best practice for meeting that criteria. And in doing that phase of work, we're partnering with the Copenhagen Business School through the Green Shipping Project, who will be helping us unpack and test and validate the preliminary set of criteria that we have developed. And then the third phase our plan is to engage with standard setting bodies and certification bodies in order to be able to bring the standard to life and to be able to be used in the market. So how we have approached this at the moment is we have undertaken a review of existing standards that are already being used in the market, particularly noting standards that are used for sustainability of biofuels. And so by taking those existing standards, which we know that fuel purchasers are already purchasing to those standards and to those certification schemes, we've got ourselves a working structure in which we can base our thinking on. And so that structure is set out as defining what the issue is, and then setting a principle, which is a aspirational goal, in order that it's able to provide that guidance on that issue. And then underneath that is a set of criteria that needs to be met in order to achieve the goal for that particular sustainability issue. And those criteria describe the best practice or set out the specific conditions of what is needed to be met. So, so that's where we are with our structure. And so what I'd like to share with you in this webinar is really setting out what we see as the key sustainability issues that need to be considered across the life cycle of potential low to zero carbon fuels. And there are a set of 14 sustainability issues that have been identified, and they have been grouped into categories of environmental, governance, social, and safety and continuous improvement. So these are the top line issues that we have identified that fuels could potentially have an impact on. So for example, you've already noted from the previous polling question, consideration of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions and other climate forcing factors is a key sustainability issue that needs to be considered when selecting a fuel. But also, there are other air quality and air emissions that need to be considered to make sure there's no unintended consequences by increasing, for example, NOx emissions. Also, land use change, as an example, was picked up in the polling question, because particularly when we start to look at some of the biomass-derived fuels, the source of that biomass may have indirect land use change impacts, which need to be considered in the life cycle of the fuel. So when we are choosing a fuel to use in shipping, that we have not caused any impact elsewhere within the fuel's life cycle. So these are the 14 that we have selected. We hope that during this webinar, we can discuss these 14. You can provide feedback on what you see as the most important and the most relevant, identify any that we may have missed that need to be included as well. But what I'll do is I'll just take you through a worked example of how these criteria fit into the structure that I talked about earlier. So as I said, we have categories. So in this worked example, it's the social category. The issue that we are talking about here is social, labour and human rights. And the principle is that for the production of sustainable zero and low carbon marine fuels, they should be respecting the social, labour and human rights during that production process. And then there's a set of criteria underneath that, particularly focusing on how operations leading to the production of the fuel shall not violate any labour or human rights of any affected populations. The operations leading to the production shall ensure that there are decent working conditions and the workforce well-being is considered, and also that operations leading to the production of the fuel shall not violate any land rights, particularly focusing on indigenous and or customary rights. So hopefully that provides an example how we go from categorizing sustainability issues into environmental, social, governance, and sustainability, safety and continuous improvement. How we then define, we have a specific issue, we set a principle of in which the fuel needs to meet, and then we set specific criteria which identifies the best practice or the conditions. And there could be multiple criteria underneath one principle, but there will be one principle underneath one sustainability issue. So hopefully that sets out the structure and the approach and identifies the 14 issues that we have currently identified. And I think I hand over now to back to Randall.
Thank you, Catherine, for that. We have some sorry about that, some muting issues. So thank you for that, Catherine. We do have some questions that are coming in, some very good questions coming in. We're going to save those till after the panelists all speak. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Mark Lutz from WWF for some remarks for about 5 minutes. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Randall, and thanks, Catherine, for that great overview. I'm Mark Lutz. I work for WWF. I'm based in Brazil. WWF works across many sectors trying to decarbonize national and global economies. The shipping sector is a very interesting case, not least of which because it's a fundamentally inherently international sector. It's not under national jurisdiction like most other economic sectors, with the somewhat exception of aviation, but even that is more nationally regulated than shipping. We're also very interested in working with the shipping sector because it's clear that there are strong voices and interests in the sector that want to clean up the sector and solve the environmental issues it's facing, including the impact on climate change. There's quite a strong effort to decarbonize the sector by mid-century. 2050 is not universal, but it's growing, and the Sustainable Shipping Initiative is strongly focused on this, and the Getting to Zero Coalition is making a very important contribution with its goal of getting technologies and fuels commercially available by 2030. An interesting thing about this challenge is that the sector doesn't control its fuel supply. The fuels have to be supplied, of course, outside the shipping sector, but the shipping sector can set clear expectations for suppliers, existing and potential suppliers, and it can send signals about what it expects from the fuels that it is looking to purchase in the coming decades. And in terms of the sustainability of those fuels, I'll just run through some of the issues of particular interest to us as an environmental organization. The shipping sector it is a significant consumer of fuels. In order to decarbonize, it needs to replace around over 300 million tons and growing of fuel of what are now fossil fuels per year, with renewable zero emission fuels or other energy sources. it's of course a great challenge, and it goes in, is not alone in this effort. There will be competition from other sectors for zero emission fuels and energy and material inputs. It's got to recognize that it's not the only player in the fuel markets. Of course, traditional fuels, especially fossil fuels, also nuclear, other fuels, have huge environmental impacts. But renewable energy sources, the fuels that we have to rely on in the future, are not exempt from impacts either. They also all involve potential risks and impacts that need to be identified, monitored, and minimized. The risks are in most cases much lower than traditional fuels, but they're not zero. So they have to be a focus of our attention and efforts going forward. And it's particularly important that we look at the entire life cycle of the fuel or energy source, including the greenhouse gas emissions over the full life cycle, and not just on board and not just tank to wake emissions, as one of the questions recognized. So no fuel should be treated as zero emissions or net zero emissions, not hydrogen or ammonia that comes from fossil fuel sources, for example, just because the onboard carbon emissions are zero, and not biofuels on the assumption, often misguided, that the emissions on board are completely offset by the growth of the plant with the materials. And crop-based biofuels in particular have posed concerns about competition with food production, carbon stocks, natural forests, including risks of direct and indirect land use change. This has to be a very, very well considered issue going forward for this sector. And certification can play a role in that. And part of our effort as the Sustainable Shipping Initiative is coming up with some basic principles and criteria to help the shipping sector inform decisions about certification schemes. There are already some out there that we can probably choose among existing systems, and may need to develop new standard systems and perhaps improve some of the existing certification systems. One important issue that I'll just mention here without getting into the details. Of course, we, as Catherine said, our approach to criteria for fuels is fuel agnostic, but we hope the sector itself won't be fuel agnostic. There are clear choices to be made between, for example, green versus all the different types of potential fuels, hydrogen, ammonia-based fuels that could come from coal, natural gas, even nuclear power, or we hope we go in the direction of renewable energy, especially wind and solar, that where prices are dropping, and there's a huge potential to expand as a energy source, as a basis for fuel supplies for the sector. So I'll leave it at that and come back in the question and answer. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. And not sure if you had a chance to glance at the chat while you're speaking, but lots of interesting questions coming in, including one specifically asking the position of WWF and SSI on CCS. So there's keep the questions coming. These are really some fantastic questions. What we'll do is we'll, as suggested earlier, we'll run through our speakers and then we'll open back up and take these questions one at a time. Over to you, Simon Bennett from the China Navigation Company.
Thank you, Randall. Thank you, Mark. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. And thanks to the Getting to Zero Coalition and the SSI for inviting me to this, to give a ship owner's, managed operator's perspective, which I guess is timely because we seem to be the the largest representative sample and the number of attendees who were here at the beginning of the meeting, we have sustainability concerns. As a company, we have to do the right thing, period. We're required to do that internally, and we're not the only ones, I know, by a long chalk. Many of our senior managers have got sustainability KPIs, but we also have to do the right thing looking externally. Increasingly, our charterers, customers, not only expect us to do the right thing, but are conducting due diligence on us to ensure that, or assure themselves that we are doing the right thing. The questionnaires are getting longer and longer. We have had one which was 150 pages long. It's not just the climate side of things. They want to know the social side on modern slavery, child labor, on ethics and governance. But we also get asked regularly the direct question, how many grams of CO2 to transport 1 ton of my stuff from port A to port B? And more, the charterers are asking that because they have to assure themselves of their tier 1 suppliers and then down to tier 2 suppliers, or they will be attacked by their shareholders. So it's the right thing to do, and it's a necessary thing to do. We need assurance that the fuel is environmentally sustainable over its whole life cycle. Both Catherine and Mark have touched on that. It's no good taking our little chunk in the middle as to when the fuel is actually on board and we're doing whatever we do with it as an energy pathway to move the ship through the water, if we've just pushed the negative externalities somewhere else down the production chain. So that's why it's very important when we look at these criteria that we're looking at them over the whole life cycle. I've mentioned that the concerns have to cover ES and G. Safety is a big issue with, with some of the fuels, and that has to be considered as well. It may well involve extra training for the guys on board, for the storage, bunkering areas onshore, and for the transportation from wherever it's produced, depending on what type of fuel it is. It has to be economically viable. I will get no thanks at all for producing or for helping to deliver the greenest, most sustainably responsible and caring bankrupt shipping company. So it must be in the right price range. And as I think one of the questions has already picked up, we are in competition with other sectors, particularly I think aviation. Aviation's problem, both marine and aviation are obviously not included in the Paris Agreement, but we are being brought into the regulatory area that we have to do the right thing. The company I work for, it's headquartered in the UK. The UK is committed to net zero by 2050. But if your company is based in China, France, Sweden, New Zealand, Denmark, Japan, Hungary, and South Korea, so far, your countries have also committed to moving to net zero by 2050. The EU targets and the IMO targets are most definitely going to tighten up or toughen up after the 4th greenhouse study. So life is going to get harder, and we have to move to do the right thing. Aviation, as I said, will be in competition with us, but aviation has many fewer options for powering aircraft and to moving to low and zero fuel when they move past just offsetting. So they will have to pay a premium for some of the fuels, notably biofuel, and they may well price us out the market. So that's something that we have to bear in mind as well. So there's a whole range of issues. I wish there was a single silver bullet fuel, but there is not. Each fuel that we look at, and we're looking at many, they all have pros and cons, and we have to weigh them all up. our hope is that in producing a sustainability standard, that will help to reduce the offerings available. And in reducing the offerings available, that will then increase the attractiveness for the suppliers of the most sustainable fuels to increase the availability, and the market will sort of sort itself out. So there's some initial comments and perspectives from a ship owner, and I'm sure there'll be many questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that. And certainly the perspective of a ship owner is very important. As you suggested, there's not a single fuel, there's not a single answer. The most common question that we get in the fuels and technologies workstream is, what will the future be? We know that that's not the right question, and really we have to focus on, for example, what we're talking about here, which is how are we going to select it, and what are the criteria, and how are we going to evaluate, and how are we going to compare? So to talk about one fuel in particular, I'll now invite Trevor Bown from the AEA to join us. Trevor did send a caveat that he's in the middle of a snowstorm in New Hampshire, so hopefully, Trevor, your video and audio managed to get you through to us.
We'll see how long this lasts. I'll try to talk quickly. First of all, thank you so much for including me in this discussion. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to just pick up on the silver bullet thing to begin with. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ammonia and perhaps say, well, why would we do that? I would answer, you wouldn't. Generally, this is a terrible idea. If you can use heavy fuel oil for the rest of your lives and the rest of the planet's life, great, do that. That's much more energy dense. It'll get you where you're going. Unfortunately, there's also going to be some problems with that from a climate perspective. So if you can't do that, then you're going to electrify. You're going to electrify everything. It's the most efficient way to decarbonize society. But there are some things you can't electrify. And so then you get to the hard to abate sectors. And that's where we are talking about now. We're talking about things that we can't readily solve with our existing tool set. And so we look to things like hydrogen and we say, aha, yeah, great. We can store lots of hydrogen. We can transport it. Oh, no, no, that's really difficult to do. It's really difficult to store hydrogen. It's really difficult to transport hydrogen. And so where the Ammonia Energy Association steps in is we say, well, there's three ways you can manage hydrogen. You can pressurize it, you can liquefy it, or you can make ammonia. And so ammonia, there's no competition with hydrogen. Ammonia is hydrogen. The molecule is NH3, 1 nitrogen, 3 hydrogens. It's more hydrogen dense than liquid hydrogen because it's a liquid at -33 instead of -253. And so it's really a very nice chemical as long as we respect it. It has all sorts of known hazards and toxicity issues, but we make and transport 180 million tons of it every year. So we already know how to manage those problems. We've been managing them for 100 years, and from an industrial perspective and a professional workforce perspective, we know what to do with ammonia. We know how to make it, I won't use the word safe, we know how to mitigate the known hazards of ammonia. So an introduction to the Ammonia Energy Association, we've actually been around for 17 years. We just wrapped our 17th annual conference last week. 17 years ago, this was strictly a research and development idea. And really it was when the IMO launched its initial greenhouse gas strategy in 2018 that a huge commercial spotlight shone on ammonia and the work that we'd been doing in the association, and we relaunched as a trade association instead of an academic association, and we now have 80 corporations across the world from all different sectors, including research-driven startups up to some energy majors, and all of the ammonia technology companies and increasingly the ammonia producers as participants in this association that promotes the responsible use of ammonia in a sustainable energy economy. To me, the single most important thing that an association representing the interests of these industries can do is come up with a certification scheme that allows you to guarantee the carbon intensity of low carbon ammonia. So you've got your coal or natural gas-based ammonia in one corner, and you've got your low carbon ammonia in another corner. Now, we're talking about fuel agnostic. I would also argue we need to be pathway agnostic. We need to define the criteria that meet our specifications and then say, can you deliver a molecule that meets those criteria? It doesn't matter whether you're going necessarily down one production pathway, be it natural gas with carbon sequestration, or another production pathway, perhaps coal gasification with carbon sequestration, or another production pathway, perhaps wind and solar into electrolysis. Your route needs to be measured against criteria, and if your producers know those criteria, they can then demonstrate whether they meet them or not, and those things can then be priced in the market. And without pricing that in the market, you're not going to invest in the new plants. So your green ammonia producers that are on record around the world saying that they're going to build new plants, primarily in Australia as of today, those guys, they need to demonstrate the price that they're going to get for their tons of ammonia in 2028, 2030, in order that they can close the financing of those plants. So this needs to be determined in the market, whether it's from a complete final global certification scheme or an individual deal between a supplier and an off-taker. This price identification needs to happen in order that we can reach financial close and see those plants start construction. So for me, the whole conversation about certification is about allowing the market to identify a price for a product based on specified criteria. I've put up some questions on this slide here for discussion. And the first one is the pathway that I've touched on. And really, I would encourage everyone to stop focusing purely on green and blue. Bear in mind that most ammonia plants already existing are going to go into incremental decarbonization, where they're adding on electrolyzers with their steam methane reformations over here and going into the same Haber-Bosch loop. So you're going to have green hydrogen and blue hydrogen going into the same ammonia plant, producing a hybrid green-blue ammonia. And then the question is, does that mean that some of that ammonia is fully green? Or is all of that ammonia just a bit less blue? And these are very interesting questions that need to be developed and answered by a certification scheme. What you do also have is a question of whether you're trying to determine your CO2e content on a stepwise scale, where you say, oh, well, that brands as low carbon, or that brands as blue, or whether you're going to simply provide a number, 0 to 100.
Give me 10 seconds.
Thank you. Whether we're going to be tradable, meaning if you're making green ammonia at the lowest possible cost in Australia, you can sell it in Europe without necessarily needing to move the molecules. Those are all interesting questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. Those are very interesting questions. And maybe we can bring everybody back on camera and we'll start to address those and other questions that we've had coming through. I've got a list here. I've been trying to keep up with the great questions that have been coming in on the chat. If you have a question that you want to put on the chat, please do so. Please make sure you send it to panelists and attendees. Otherwise, sometimes we end up answering questions and people don't know what question we're answering. So we'll do our best to repeat and make sure that we're covering all those, all the questions that we see. So a couple of questions that I'll start with, and then we'll kind of work our way through and we'll see if more are coming in. But there was one question very early on about life cycle and well to wake versus the IMO, which is looking at the less than full life cycle. How do we reconcile that? Catherine, I don't know if you want to start with that or whether somebody else is, Mark is raising his hand. Go ahead, Mark.
I can kick off, and I'm sure others will have views as well. So, and maybe I can kick off with that question, and there's another one directed to WWF and SSI that I can tackle at the same time. So life cycle and assessment, yeah, until now, there's been pretty much only fossil fuels used in shipping, with some very small exceptions. So the life cycle hasn't been an issue. But with the IMO's initial greenhouse gas strategy, how the IMO will treat alternative fuels is definitely an issue, and the question of how to address the life cycle emissions from fuels is up for discussion at the next Marine Environment Protection Committee meeting next year. And there's a range of positions on that, and it'll be probably a hard fought and very interesting discussion. There are some precedents, for example, in ICAO for aviation, where they took a very explicit, I think quite a good life cycle approach to emissions, especially biofuels. There's an expectation that a lot of the alternative fuels for aviation will be biofuels, probably more so than for shipping, since you need the energy density. You need something equivalent to kerosene that you can get from biofuels, and they'll be looking at estimating the exact percentage and considering the exact percentage at a number from 1 to 100, something like that. Actually, and there's actually a threshold of, I think, 60% or something as a minimum reduction, so it'll be 1 to 60. I can also address the question about CCS, carbon capture and storage. And speaking for WWF as SSI, it's come up, but we don't have a clear position on it. But for WWF, I would say WWF was probably more optimistic about the potential for CCS 10 or 15 years ago than we are now. And one of the reasons for that is cost. The costs of CCS haven't gone down, and the technology hasn't advanced that much. It's still almost exclusively used for enhanced oil recovery and not for sequestration from stationary plants with geological storage. There's still only 1 or 2 examples of that, and not terribly economically viable. The other problem with CCS is that the alternatives are becoming cheaper. Renewable energy, the costs of wind and solar have gone down 70–80% in the last 10 years. So the competition with CCS with high costs and renewable energy with the cost dropping dramatically and still going down doesn't generate a lot of optimism. The last problem is that CCS can only capture a maximum of something like 80 or 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions. The rest still goes to the atmosphere. So it's not going to get us to zero emissions in production of fuels. And if you're using CCS for natural gas in particular, natural gas has a problem of fugitive emissions, leakage in production, transport, distribution. So that's another source of greenhouse gas emissions that CCS is not going to address. Thanks.
Well, maybe I can jump right in there with one you missed off your list, Mark, which is that there's essentially a liability mismatch. You're producing fuels to sell within, the current quarter, and creating a liability that's got a economic life of some thousands of years that you, as a corporation, are not yet. We don't have the legal structure to really understand what that means. So you've got a low carbon ammonia project moving forward in Indiana, in the US, called Wabash Valley Resources, which is a pure geologic sequestration project, no enhanced oil recovery associated. Department of Energy is helping the funding of that, the feasibility and the studies there. And they're taking an installed coal gasification power plant, repurposing it for low carbon hydrogen production. The benefit of gasification versus steam methane reformation is you can capture a much larger percentage of the carbon dioxide coming out of that plant. So they're capturing more, closer to 98% of the carbon dioxide of that plant. It's not constructed yet, of course, but and then they're proposing to market that low carbon fertilizer into the ethanol production market in the US and deliver lower carbon ethanol into the Californian low carbon fuel standard market. So it's an interesting pathway. I think the thing I would say from the fuel sustainability criteria perspective is, do you want to prescribe whether that pathway is acceptable or not? Or do you want to allow different regions to come up with the pathways that they think are regionally acceptable according to their own jurisdictions?
Thanks, Trevor. And I think that opens up to a lot of questions around who decides these things. And there was a question in the chat around, when we talk about these certifications, who is it that certifies? And Catherine, maybe there's a couple of questions here that have come through that are relevant to you. So one of them was about risk. And the question was, how will risk be quantified and incorporated into the sustainability assessment? Safety, supply risk, land-based demand price fluctuation risk, stranded asset risks. All of these impact the sustainability of any fuel choice. So that's one question, Catherine, and the open question around when we talk about sustainability criteria, whose criteria are they, who sets them, and who decides that?
Yeah, so they're really interesting questions. I think as SSI, we haven't concluded, so I'll just give some initial thinking of where it is we're going. So in terms of criteria, what we're sort of seeing is in a sense, it provides a standard of which the market can use. So, if we think about it at the moment, we have a voluntary fuel standard for fossil-based fuels, that's set out, so ISO 8217 sets out fuel standards. And what happens is, customers buy to that standard and producers produce to that standard. So you get that assurance that you're buying a product that meets X. And that is voluntary. That's not a mandated scheme, I would point out. So in a sense, from a sustainability perspective, we can do the same, that we can say that for other non-fossil based fuels that are going to be in shipping's fuel mix, they meet a certain criteria, which says as an end user, you can purchase to that, and as a producer, you can produce to that, and there is that market there for people to say, here's what we want to buy to, and the producer, here's the standard we need to sell if we want to put our product into that market. In terms of certification of that, then that would just be, any certification body that has competence could certify against that. So I think, anyone who numerous certification bodies already exist. They certify and verify against various standards. If you demonstrate competence against that, you can verify against and certify that product to meet that standard. Therefore, the purchaser has that assurance. I think how risk is included at the moment, our consideration of risk, we've got safety and continuous improvement as a principle or as a category. We've got safety risk as a specific principle, and I think that's also how we may consider taking forward the kind of continuous improvement thing that. So I would say safety is definitely included. We wanted this to be, although economic is part of the overall terminology of sustainability. At the moment, we're not including economic criteria because we see that would just be dealt with as the market you know, what is the market willing to pay for a fuel that has better sustainability credentials than another fuel that has a different set of sustainability credentials. So I think we're leaving economic risk out of this at the moment.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. There was a question, Simon, that you might have some thoughts on, and it was related to saying that we're fuel agnostic. And the question was asking about the difference between fuel agnostic versus propulsion agnostic. Because if we say we're fuel agnostic and we're comparing side by side through criteria, then we're perhaps automatically excluding wind, for example, as a propulsion. And how would you react to that, Simon? Is that something that you guys are looking into more broadly? Is it something that's completely off? And how would you differentiate between being fuel agnostic and propulsion agnostic, as the term was used?
I can assure Gavin, we definitely have not excluded wind. Maybe it's a semantic issue that we've called it fuel agnostic. But as a ship owner, I'm willing to look at anything to get my ship from A to B in an economic and timely manner and carry the cargo. And questions just come in without excluding all the cargo because we're storing some method of providing energy. So I can see wind being included. And as a company, we are looking at wind. But yes, it's not been excluded from our discussions here. Solar's not been excluded, but it's going to have to work very hard to give us the energy we need to move a ship around, a commercial ship.
Great, thanks, Simon. Trevor, there's a few questions on ammonia that have come in. I'm going to give you, you're not going to have a lot of time to answer them, of course, but there's one about kind of ammonia competition or competing with fertilizer industry in the food side of things. There was another one that just came in terms of the energy density and what that's going to mean on a vessel. And then there was another one kind of on the green ammonia, and I think that was picking up on the green versus turquoise. So maybe 30 seconds each of those, which is completely unfair, but
today's market is we currently produce about 180 million tons per year. Of that, 80% is for fertilizers, and roughly 10% is traded merchant ammonia going onto maritime vessels and being shipped from one country to another. There's also a turn down capacity. There's lots of additional production. So the plants are generally running about 75% capacity around the world. So if you wanted to say, hey, can we have some free supply without having to build a new plant? Yeah, you price it in the market. People can ramp up production. They can deliver the tons. If you want to move into not competing with the fertilizer and food production market for maritime fuel, first I would say maritime shipping is like 4 times the size of fertilizer on a product ton basis. So if this industry is moving, fertilizer is going to be fine. We're going to have an excess of product on the market from the perspective of fertilizers. To talk about scale up and availability of green ammonia was one of the questions. I would just like run you through what's happened this year. Beginning of the year, we had a 5 megawatt project talking about building an electrolyzer on the Porsgrunn plant in Norway. Then early in the year, we had a 20 megawatt project announced at Fertiberia in Spain. Then Yara announced a 100 megawatt project with Ørsted at the Sluiskil plant in the Netherlands. Then Fertiberia came back and said, actually, no, they were going to do all their plants, 800 megawatts in Spain. Then Asian Renewable Energy Hub gets approval for its 15 gigawatts in the Pilbara, gigawatts into hydrogen electrolysis, into ammonia production for export. And having got environmental improvement on that, they then announced that actually they were going to scale up to 26 gigawatts. At which point Fortescue announces that they're going to have a portfolio of 235 gigawatts of hydrogen and green ammonia production around the world. So that's 2020. Beside the pandemic, we've gone from 5 megawatts to 235 gigawatts of project development around the world for green ammonia. And so I don't see competition between one sector and another sector being a problem. What I see, the problem is demand signals. We need to accept ammonia will be there. It's available if we want it. If we put in some order books, they'll build the plants. There's no shortage of renewable energy and seawater to desalinate. We can build it. Yeah, it needs the demand there. It needs the demand.
Great, thanks, Trevor. This is a fascinating conversation, and obviously we could take it much deeper and much longer, but what I'm going to have to do is ask us all to have some very quick kind of final reactions or closing remarks. In order, I will go Mark, Catherine, Trevor, Simon, just for fun. And so maybe 30 seconds each, and then what we're going to do is we're going to open up our poll one more time for a final question and see where we've got to before we close. So Mark, final kind of comments, thoughts, reactions from this conversation?
Sure. So I think it's clear there's a pathway ahead to decarbonize the sector fairly quickly. I think 2050 is a horizon that's entirely doable. So so let's commit the sector to generating a demand and scale up the production of the cleanest sources of alternative fuels possible.
Excellent, thanks. I can't remember the order that I just said. We'll go Catherine.
Yeah, well, I will add then to Morg's comment that, you know, yes, fully supportive of that's what we need to do, but we need to make sure whilst doing that, we do not create unintended consequences elsewhere. And that is why we need to be setting our sustainability criteria for whatever that cleanest source of energy is going to be for shipping. And I think having a standard, that is both fuel neutral, but also production pathway neutral, you know, because that then just allows the market to adapt to the fact that here's the standard we expect. You know, Simon set out why the end consumer needs it, you know, because your ship owners, customers and investors also expect that from us, that we should be buying to that standard. So I think it's really important we don't cause any unintended consequences, and we look at things from a life cycle perspective. Thanks,
Catherine. Trevor?
I completely agree with the points that the other panelists made. The one thing I would add at this point is let's not wait until 2050 to do this. It's going to take time to create a sustainability certification standard scheme as broad-ranging as the one that's under proposal here. And we're probably going to begin trading certified low-carbon ammonia in 2021. So let's make sure that we're doing it in a coordinated fashion that can use small projects, perhaps in the fertilizer market, as demonstration projects that are going to be applicable to maritime. Let's make sure that we're signaling clearly what needs to be reported. What metrics do you look to from an ammonia producer in order that you can say, oh, that makes sense, that not necessarily that's going to be certified to meet, but at least we're talking the same language, we're counting the same things, and we're building expertise in what needs to be done here. But it's going to start very, very quickly, and we need to be moving on it.
Great, thanks, Trevor. And Simon?
We have to decarbonize. I sit on GTZ meetings, I sit on SSI meetings, I talk to other people. There's a plethora of potential fuel and propulsion pathways out there, and I don't see the answer yet. We need informed help, and I think this will go some way to deliver it. I have a fear, a suspicion, a worry that we're not going to get a single replacement for fossil fuel, and that it may end up being regionally based or trade based, which is going to hurt shipping companies' flexibility, which they've been used to, because you can take on fuel oil more or less any port in the world. But maybe that's for another seminar.
Thanks, Simon. Certainly the silver bullet is not what we're going to have. So we've heard that we can do it. We've heard that we must quantify it and we must track that so that we can know what is correct. And we know that we can't take too much time. So very quickly, as we're wrapping up, we've got our second poll, which is actually the same as our second question earlier on, just to see whether there have been any shifts. What do we think? Do we come into this exactly the same? Have we shifted? Are any of these issues kind of heightened in our awareness that we want to select? And while we're doing that, I want to thank our panelists. It was really great. Catherine Palmer, Mark Lutz, Simon Bennett, and Trevor Brown. I also wanted to thank SSI, Nicole and Andrew, for helping us kind of get this off the ground and design it. To make sure that we got our panelists and listed them and we're able to kind of get the right questions and content for such an interesting conversation. As mentioned earlier, this has been recorded, it will be made available, and we will get a summary together. And it's great to see some of the comments coming in of people looking to engage. And with that, we'll go over to our poll results to see how many people have answered that while I've been talking, and to see whether it's the same as when we came on or whether we've kind of opened our minds, shifted the way we're looking at things a little bit. I've got that one. I just need the poll results from this one, and we'll see how we did. And while we're waiting for that, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. We're 1 minute over, so not a perfect finish for my track record, but really great that everybody's been able to join us. We had a good crowd and we had some excellent speakers. Just waiting to see if those poll results pop up. But it's calculating, people are dropping off, it's a race. So GHG emissions still the winner. Before it was 85% in the top three, and now it's kind of 50% and a little bit more on the carbon source and hydrogen source. And with that, I think that we're at our time. People are ready to move on to the next conversation, but certainly this is only the beginning of this conversation. So thanks again to our panelists. Thanks to all who have joined, and we look forward to working together as we move this to its logical flow and moving it towards action. So thanks again. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Randall. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.